Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the makeup class for class 18. This lecture is intended to make up the class that we would have had on Thursday, May the 5th, which, as you know, was Children's Day. I've decided that rather than go on to chapter 8 and start looking at argumentative essays, instead, I'm going to take this opportunity to take a look back at everything that we've done in the course so far. So going all the way back to the beginning of the textbook, I'll go one by one through all of the points. Most of this you're probably quite familiar with because the midterm exam actually is not too far behind us. But if there's anything that you might have forgotten or anything that you'd like to review, this lecture is definitely going to be for you. I'll go through all of the different rules of critical thinking that we've looked at so far. And then after that, I'll finish up actually with the last part of the class that we had last week, where I don't think I was able to finish my presentation. There's a little bit that we didn't get to, so I'll do that at the end of this lecture. So please sit back and let's take a look at critical thinking through English composition, going all the way back to week 2 when we started with the textbook. I'll be making comments and observations as I go along as well. Okay. So really quickly, this is what I'll be looking at over the next 30 minutes or so. General rules for short arguments, I'll be going through those, as well as arguments by example, arguments by analogy, arguments from authority, arguments about causes, deductive arguments, and what we've been looking at for the last 2 classes, extended arguments. Okay, so got some notes here. Let's get started. So what actually is arguing? It's not just about stating your opinion in opposition to someone else's thoughts. To give an argument means to offer a set of reasons or evidence in support of a conclusion. It's not just a statement of certain views, and it's not simply a dispute either. It's about supporting certain views with reasons. Arguing is a way that we can find out which views are superior to others. Not all views are equal. Some views and opinions can be supported with valid arguments and legitimate reasons. Others have much weaker support. One thing that I hope this course has given you is a number of ways that you can assess whether your arguments or someone else's arguments are legitimate or not. After you arrive at a conclusion that is well supported by reasons, you can use your arguments to explain and defend it. A good argument does not just repeat its conclusions, it offers reasons and evidence so that people can make up their minds for themselves. First of all, it's not a mistake to hold strong views. There's nothing wrong with having a very strong opinion on a given topic. The only mistake would be to not have anything beyond that opinion. It's a mistake if you don't have anything else. If you become convinced of something, you can convince other people too. But in order to do that, you need to show people how you arrived at your conclusion. And if your reasons are good enough, then there's a strong possibility that you might persuade someone to come over to your point of view. When we're young, we tend to start with our conclusions, actually. When we learn about an issue, we have a gut feeling as to whether something is right or wrong, or whether the government should or should not do something. And then we will often make up reasons to justify that opinion after the fact. However, it's very important that you go beyond that, especially as you get older. Real arguments involve gathering reasons, proportioning our conclusions to the actual evidence, considering objections, etc. So now that I've said that, let's take a quick look at some of these general rules for short arguments. We've got resolving premise and conclusion, unfolding your ideas in a natural order, starting from reliable premises, being concrete and precise, building on substance, not overtone, and finally using consistent terms. So when it comes to resolving premises and conclusion, you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to prove? The conclusion is the statement for which you are giving reasons, and the premises are the statements that give your reasons. Remember, don't assume that people have heard or are familiar with your reasons. And even if they have, it's still useful to remind them. It can also be useful if you add humor to liven up a typical or boring premises. So let's take a look. Resolve, that also means to distinguish. So to clearly distinguish or to clearly separate your premises, which are your reasons, from your conclusions. And resolve, that means to commit to. If you can't commit to both, then change one or the other. But be clear to yourself. It's essential. It can be difficult to distinguish between premises and conclusion because the arguments may not be clear, they may lack indicator words, or they may have other kinds of information. So if you encounter some information, whether it's a full page, a paragraph, a tweet, whatever it is, and it's filled with information, ask yourself, is this sentence stating a conclusion, or is it giving me a reason to believe that conclusion? If it's doing either, then it's part of the argument. And if it's not, then it's not. Okay, unfolding your ideas in a natural order. This is very important. What is the best order? I mean, do you start with the conclusion and then work backwards with your premises, or do you list your premises first and then have your conclusion at the end? What order would the premises sound best delivered in? If the premises are building on each other, it might be better to start with a more specific, more general premise and then work towards more specific examples. There's no hard and fast rule, but it is a good idea to try a few different forms and then decide on which one makes the most sense. We looked at a couple of examples in this class, and there was even a question on the midterm exam. This was for putting microchips in your body. We've already become quite comfortable putting technology into our body. For example, pacemakers can help regulate a heartbeat, and that's a much bigger deal, according to the argument, than having a small microchip in your hand, which can be used for various things. Okay, next, to start from reliable premises. This is something which I believe I've emphasized several times throughout the course. Are your premises plausible? Do they need serious defense? Are there any of your premises that are unlikely true? Are the examples accurate? It's very important to start from reliable, believable premises. Are there any well-known examples? Do you need to do research? Remember, what is a reliable premise for one person might not be a reliable premise for someone else. Everybody comes to an argument with very, very different background information and knowledge. If you are talking to one group of people, you might be able to use some premises in your argument which won't require serious defense because everyone already accepts those premises. If you are in front of an unfriendly or hostile audience, one that perhaps has a very different opinion on a specific topic than you do, you might need to have much more serious research done and arguments to back up each of those premises, which is what we get to later on in extended arguments. Okay, to be concrete and concise, I think I've mentioned this before, you don't need to use flowery language and try to impress listeners and readers with very, very long, obtuse quotations. Sometimes the simplest expressions are the best. You're not here to try and impress the audience or the reader with how intelligent you are and how much complicated vocabulary you know. You're there to express an opinion on a topic and to support your argument with reliable premises. And in many cases, just using the most basic language is often the most effective. Speaking of the language that you use, it's important to build on substance. So use facts, use things that are true. Try to use relatively neutral language rather than using loaded language. We looked at several examples of loaded language in the class. And although loaded language is often used in public discourse, politicians use it to discredit their competition. People will post tweets that have loaded language in order to convince people of the merits of their argument. I would strongly suggest using a more fair, neutral form of language that will build its strength on substance rather than overtone. It's also important to use consistent terms. If you're going to be talking about something, if you start to use many different terms for the same thing, it can get confusing if those terms do not necessarily have the same meaning. So trying to limit, especially for keywords, trying to limit the number of different words that you use and taking great care to make sure that they have the same meaning so that you're not stretching out the meaning that you're trying to express is very important. A good example of this might be when somebody is talking about reasons why you should own a pet. And then they'll start talking about how, for example, owning a pet can, or having a dog can help motivate people to exercise more and can get them out of the house, et cetera, et cetera. And while that is true for a dog, it's not the same if you have a pet hamster. A dog is a form of pet, but not all pets are dogs. So take care if you're going to use a term, try to be consistent. It should be not a subordinate or what's the other term? Uberordinate? I can't quite recall. Try to make sure that the words that you use do have a consistent meaning. Okay, moving on to arguments by example. Here we've got rules 7 through 11. Use more than one example, finding relevant examples, using representative examples, background rates, statistics, and counterexamples. Some arguments offer multiple examples in support of a generalization. If you are going to make a generalization, it's important not just to have one example. So remember to list your premises separately with the conclusion on the bottom line. Therefore, even if your example is accurate, generalizing can be a little bit tricky. I mean, you could be cherry picking. That's why it's important to use more than one example. A single example can be used for an illustration if you want to illustrate a case, but not so much a generalization. The case that you are picking might actually just be an exception. For example, if you say that solar power is widely used, therefore renewable energy is widely used, that's not really accurate. Because although solar power is a form of renewable energy, it's not the only form of renewable energy. Solar power is widely used. Hydroelectric power has also been widely used. Okay, now that's a little bit better because now you have two examples and both of them are forms of renewable energy. At least one more example would probably be a good suggestion for strengthening your argument. Remember, generalizations about small sets of things should consider each thing in turn, whereas generalizations about large sets of things require picking out a sample. And this is where we come to using representative examples. If you're going to be talking about a very general topic, I think in the textbook they mention women have traditionally married at quite young ages throughout history. Well, in that case, you would need to give several representative examples, from different societies and different time periods in order to demonstrate the validity of your point. If you just say women in Roman times married young, therefore women married young throughout the ages, that's not very effective because you're only using one example from one time period in one society in order to make a very broad generalization. Remember, The argument needs to consider women from other early times and other places as well. It's very easy to overlook actually how unrepresentative our own personal samples are. It's very common for people to generalize about people in their city, that have certain characteristics, or even generalizing about human nature in general. And we often do these things with relatively small sample sizes. If you want to say, for example, that, well, people in my neighborhood have a particular political opinion, therefore the city will vote a certain way. That's not necessarily true. Single neighborhood preferences do not necessarily represent voting preferences in a whole town. If you want to know what foreigners think of your country, it's not a very representative sample if you just ask tourists, because this is obviously a self-selecting group. These are people that have come to your country. They obviously have some kind of interest in it. So it might be not accurate to just focus on that one group. I think I gave another example. If you wanted to find out, for example, I think this is moving on to background, to statistics. If you want to make a generalization about what university students think, and you only ask students from your own university, it's quite dangerous to try and generalize what university students in your country might think about something if you've only asked university students in your own university. It would probably be better to narrow your focus and just change your argument to, this is what based on the representative sample, this is what people at my university think, rather than people in my country or people in this university students in this region. Let's see, background rates. Yeah, getting a bullseye in one shot and getting a bullseye in 1,000 shots are quite different. The significance of these are quite different, even though the end result is the same. There was a single bullseye that was accomplished. Remember that this is the same when it comes to predictions. If someone says, "Oh, a fortune teller is very accurate because they gave me a prediction that turned out to be true." How many predictions did they make, however? If somebody makes 30 predictions and only one of them comes true, well, in that case, the accuracy rate is quite low, possibly not more than random chance. In that case, 1 in 30 tries is not very reliable. It's just lucky once in a while. Okay, yeah, dramatic success and abysmal success rates can actually be the same thing. So if you get one bullseye, if you did it just with one shot, that's a dramatic success. If you did it, if you get a bullseye after shooting 1,000 arrows, the end result is the same, but the second one, the latter, is an abysmal failure, or at least an abysmal success rate compared to the former. The same thing about lottery winners. If you think to yourself, well, oh, somebody in my hometown won the lottery, so therefore, if I buy a lottery ticket, I will also have a chance of winning the lottery. Although that is true, if you take a look at the background rates, you will notice that the likelihood of winning is actually abysmally low. Statistics. I believe in class I gave the old quotation often attributed to Mark Twain. There are lies, damned lies, and statistics. Apparently, this was not originally said by Mark Twain. The quote is actually has a much older lineage. However, it should be said that statistics can be misused, so you should be very careful when you use them, and also apply a skeptical eye to statistics when you hear them in other people's arguments. Some people see numbers and conclude that they must make a good argument. For some people, when they see numbers seem to have this aura of authority, right? 65% of people say something. The rate of something else has doubled. How can you argue with that? However, numbers require just as much critical thinking as any other kind of evidence. When an argument includes percentages and rates, the actual numbers must be included to be convincing. I think in class we looked at the example of car thefts on a university campus doubling. Well, if that means that 2 cars were stolen rather than 1, that's a very big difference between the number of cars being stolen doubling from 500 to 1,000. Being overly exact can also be suspicious. They say that every year 4,325 cups are wasted on campus, plastic or paper cups. You might wonder, well, how did such a specific number? How was such a specific number found? How did they arrive at that number? This very specific nature of it calls it into question. And why is it every year? Does this number not change? The way a question is asked can also make a great difference in how people answer, which can also therefore manipulate a final statistic. This is often done in political polling, where questions are asked in such a way if the poller wants to get a positive or negative response. Next, many apparently hard statistics and numbers are based on guesswork and extrapolation. And this is partially because people will often have motivation to answer in a certain way, either by giving a number that is larger than reality or a number that is significantly smaller. If you wanted to find out, for example, the number of illegal workers in an industrial area, let's say there's an industrial area outside of town, a number of factories there, and it's very highly suspected or well known that there are at least some workers there that do not have a working visa, they've been brought in. In that case, if you were just to ask the companies themselves, how many illegal workers do you have at your factory? If you were to take just the numbers that were supplied by the factories themselves, that might actually give you a completely inaccurate number in terms of the real figure. And that's because obviously the factories would have a motivation for underreporting the actual number. Okay, also, it's important to reckon with counterexamples. When you think of counterexamples to a generalization that you want to defend, you need to adjust, refine, and acknowledge the limits of your generalization. Let's go back to the example of renewable energy. Is it a good idea to say that renewable energy is used widely? Some forms of renewable energy are used widely, but others are not. It might be better to refine the argument and just say that some renewables are used widely, or that many places have used different renewables that could be further developed. Counterexamples are good for addressing not only your own claims, but others' claims as well. Okay, let's go on now to arguments by analogy. An analogy is a comparison where you try to show that one person, place, or thing or phenomenon has certain characteristics in common with something else. And there's quite often a conclusion that people will draw from this. You might remember the example of the Russian astronaut who said, women are as capable of demanding physical work and demanding technical work as men, and they're also as dedicated to their country as men, and as demonstrated by the example of female railroad workers. Therefore, women should also make fine astronauts. Now, this obviously is taking a look at two different things, being a railroad worker versus being an astronaut, drawing similarities, drawing a comparison between these things. Being an astronaut requires demanding physical work. Also, it demands a great deal of technical knowledge. Not so sure about the premise of the need for patriotism, although that might be included, I guess. Remember, if you wanted to use this analogy, a similar analogy, the first thing you have to do is make sure that your premises are true. Remember one of the earlier rules I discussed, start from reliable premises. Have women proven themselves to be capable railroad workers? If in this case, women had not actually proven themselves to be capable railroad workers, then that would be a very glaring flaw in the argument, right? Let me just move over here. Yeah, so let me quickly give a little bit more of a concise definition of an analogy. Yeah, it's a premise based on an analogy, says A is like B, from which the argument draws a conclusion. How relevantly similar are the two cases? They don't have to be similar in every way. In the example of the railroad worker, for example, how relevant is physical stamina? Is physical stamina as important in railroad work as it is in being an astronaut? How similar are the levels of technical skills that are necessary? Obviously, this analogy was made in a much earlier period of time when perhaps those things might have been more relevant. So I think the analogy in that case is at least partially successful. You might remember the example that I gave in class when we talked about analogies. I brought up the lyrics for the Kenny Rogers song, The Gambler, which essentially compares life to playing the card game poker, and says, for example, in poker, you cannot control the cards that you are given, just as in life, you cannot control the circumstances in which you are born. However, every hand is a winner, every hand is a loser. Whatever circumstances you're born with, that doesn't determine your ultimate fate. It depends how skillfully you play that hand. And somewhere in the darkness, the gambler, he broke even. Okay, moving on to arguments from authority. We've got several rules here that I'd like to quickly review. Remember to cite your sources, seek informed sources, seek impartial sources, remember to cross-check your sources, and build your internet savvy. So watch out, be careful when you quote sources from the internet. There are some very good sources out there, but there are also some very biased sources as well. No one can be an expert on everything, so we rely on experts with greater knowledge than us. It's very dangerous just to say, however, X says Y, therefore Y is true. Supposed experts might be overconfident. Experts might be misled. Some experts might not even be reliable. Everyone has biases, even if they're innocent ones. So let's say you want to choose a source and use that source to support your argument. What kind of source should you look for? Well, first of all, you should seek informed sources. Does the source have the appropriate background and information? Remember, an informed source doesn't necessarily need to be a stereotype of an authority, and a person who fits a certain authority stereotype might not even be an informed source. Remember, just because someone has a PhD or someone is a doctor does not necessarily mean they are an expert in something besides that field of specialty. Doctors and people with PhDs are experts in one field, but they're not experts in everything. Okay. Yeah, just because someone has a PhD or MD in some field doesn't mean they're qualified to deliver opinions on any subject whatsoever. Sometimes we do, however, need to rely on sources that have better knowledge than ourselves, but is still limited. Acknowledge the problem and let people decide whether imperfect knowledge is better than none at all. This is especially true if you are giving a presentation on a controversial topic where maybe scientists are divided as to whether a claim might be true or untrue. The probability of life on other planets, for example, there are numerous scientists on both sides of the argument that would say it is more or less likely. Remember to seek impartial sources as well. People with a lot at stake are not usually the best sources of information, or people that seek to convert, convince, or persuade you of a particular issue. I think in our last class, someone was looking at PETA, the PETA website, which is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Although there may be some links to research on the PETA homepage that might be legitimate, PETA itself is a highly biased source. Also remember to cross-check sources, consult a variety of sources to see if they agree on a particular point. If so, it's safe, but it's not certain. Yeah, if there is disagreement among experts, reserve judgment. And remember, just because somebody might be an expert does not necessarily mean that they are not an outlier. I gave an example of one particular scientist that said humans could be able to live to 1,000 years old. I think this was Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Humans could live to be 1,000 years old if they do certain things. When I looked up some of the criticism of Dr. de Grey's work, he's obviously an outlier. He is a doctor in the field of the study of aging, but he is by no means representative of what the vast majority of experts in the field say. His opinion is quite unique and quite different from most of his contemporaries. Okay, moving on to arguments about causes. 4 important rules here. Remember, causal arguments start with correlations. First of all, it's important to determine that there is a correlation. I mean, just because 2 things seem correlated does not necessarily mean that they necessarily are. I believe I gave the example of the number of Nicolas Cage movies that are released in a given year actually corresponds with the number of people who accidentally drown in swimming pools. However, this is a very spurious connection, and you would not, in a serious situation, try to establish a correlation. Remember, there are many different possible correlations. I mean, A might cause B, or it could be the opposite. B might cause A, or A might just be one of several factors that, that result in B. Correlations may also have alternate explanations. And it's a good idea to brainstorm as many possible explanations for these correlations as you can. And then when you've got a list of different correlations, then you work towards the most likely explanation. Okay, moving on to deductive arguments. We looked at this in a lot of detail before the midterm exam. We've got modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, disjunctive syllogism, and dilemmas. If P, Q, P is true, therefore Q is also true. The whole point of a deductive argument is it's a way of analyzing information and coming to a reliable conclusion. I'll just quickly give you a definition here. An argument whereby if the premises is true, then the conclusion must also be true. Properly formed, deductive arguments are also valid arguments. In non-deductive arguments, the conclusion would go beyond the premises. The conclusion in a deductive argument, however, only makes explicit what is already contained in the premises. So, for example, modus ponens. If P, Q, P, therefore Q. If drivers on cell phones have more accidents, then they should be prohibited from using them. Well, okay, then, so that's if, so P in that case is, just got that. If drivers on cell phones have more accidents, and then Q, then they should be prohibited from using them. Well, turns out people on cell phones do have more accidents. Therefore, they should be prohibited from using them. Or modus tollens, if PQ, but not Q, therefore not P. You might remember the example of Galileo, who said, these lights in the sky, if they were stars, then they would be bright and they would be arranged randomly, but they're not as bright as stars, and they're not arranged randomly. They're arranged in a line. Well, therefore, they must not be stars. And then the hypothetical syllogism: if Korea wins the World Cup, then I'll owe my friend a lot of money. If I owe my friend a lot of money, I'll have to go to the bank. Therefore, if Korea wins the World Cup, I'll have to go to the bank. Disjunctive syllogism: that's when you've narrowed an issue down to two possible options, P or Q. Okay. Did Young-hee steal the money, or did Chol-soo steal the money? Well, if we've been able to narrow it down to where those are the only two logical choices, it's either Young-hee that did it or Chol-soo that did it. Young-hee didn't do it. Well, therefore, Chol-soo must have done it. A dilemma, on the other hand, that's where you're looking at the consequence of two possible actions. There's a situation and I can do P or Q. If I do P, then R will be the consequence. If I do Q, then S will be the consequence. I've got to choose one of these. So therefore, I'm going to experience either R or S. On the midterm exam, I used the quotation from The Matrix. You know, you can take the red pill or the blue pill as an example of that. Reductio ad absurdum, that's where you try to prove not only that a claim is false, but it is ridiculous. And you do that by assuming the claim to be true, and then saying, well, if the claim is true, well, then this follows naturally. What was the example? I think in the textbook, my teacher's version of the textbook, they had the example of was that nobody has had sex in space, because if somebody had sex in space, then that would mean that someone has done that and then not told anyone. They've been able to keep it a secret. And that is very hard to believe. So therefore, the original claim is false. On the midterm exam, there was an example of reductio ad absurdum, and that was where there was the court trial with a drug lord from Mexico who claimed to have bribed the president-elect of Mexico with, I forget how many millions of dollars. And in the trial, they used reductio ad absurdum to say that it was not true. They said, listen, let's assume that was true, that he had bribed the president-elect with these millions of dollars in cash. That would have meant that he had been able to deliver this large sum of money without anyone noticing, and that's ridiculous. So therefore, it couldn't have happened. By the way, as with any deductive argument, they are not bulletproof. There are reasons why, even though something may seem to be unbelievable, it actually could be believable. I was reading about this case involving the drug lord from Mexico, the cartel leader, and someone pointed out, well, we don't know, first of all, whether the bribe was paid in one large cash payment. Perhaps it was delivered in several installments, in which case it would have been easier to transport. And also, this drug lord is obviously quite skilled at moving large amounts of drugs from one place to another without being caught. So therefore, the chances that this person might be able to move a shipment of cash and then that not be noticed, actually, that's not beyond the realm of possibility. Okay, now I'm just about up to where we were last week, extended arguments. I started that class by saying, whenever you approach an issue, it's possible to identify many different positions. Sometimes, if you're just going to take a very standard issue, for example, the death penalty, you don't necessarily need to say it is absolutely that the death penalty should be abolished or should not be abolished, because in many cases and for many issues, people do not agree 100%. Some people might say, well, I believe the death penalty should be abolished, except in certain cases, or I believe the death penalty shouldn't be abolished, with some exceptions. Also, it's a good idea especially if you're approaching an issue that is very, very well defined and has been discussed ad nauseum. For example, school uniforms, the death penalty, euthanasia, abortion. There are a number of topics that are extremely well covered, let's just say, and books and millions of YouTube videos have been made with persuasive speeches and argumentative debates, etc. However, it is possible to find new perspectives or new angles to look at an issue from. In class, I gave the example of the death penalty. You don't necessarily need to argue that the death penalty should be abolished. You might just want to argue that certain forms of the death penalty should be abolished. Maybe, for example, you think hanging or lethal injection is a cruel and unusual punishment. Or maybe if you're going to do an argument on euthanasia, it's not that euthanasia should be legalized or not. Maybe you want to focus on a very specific argument. For example, if for example, a child has a terminal illness, should a child be able to decide that they want to end their life with euthanasia, or should it be the parent's responsibility? So definitely identify possible positions, look at it from different angles, and then once you've come up with your position, then you have to put your argument into a premise and conclusion form. It's very important not just to look at your own perspective, but look at other perspectives as well, especially on the opposite side. So sketch some arguments both for and against. Make sure you know both sides of the argument quite well. And remember, when you do your own perspective, you might think that your premises are quite strong, but remember, not everyone is going to accept your premises unconditionally, which is why it's a good idea to defend basic premises with arguments of their own. Take a look at each of your premises and turn them into a conclusion. If each of your premises are a conclusion, well then what premises would you need, whether they're facts, citing sources, statistics, do you want to draw an analogy? What are you going to do to try and prove the truth of each of those premises? Remember, you might be in front of an audience that is not friendly, could be possibly hostile to your opinion, and you want to persuade them. Be ready to defend each of your basic ideas. Okay, and for the last two here, reckoning with objections and exploring alternatives, I'm actually going to go back to my original PowerPoint presentation just to finish off today, because I was not able to do this last time. So just a moment here, I'll quickly bring this up. Okay, and okay, there we go. Okay, so really quickly, yeah, reckon with objections. Don't forget or downplay the cons, because not everyone values your pros. You might have a very strong opinion on a particular topic. However, it's important to remember that not everyone accepts the premises that you want to give. Not everyone is on your side. So try to ask yourself, what is the best argument against my conclusion? If somebody wanted to tear down my argument, what is the strongest argument against what I want to prove? Remember, important objections can be found on both sides, and anticipating the objections can not only help you refine a proposal or an argument, but they can help you win a debate. If you're not prepared to deal with objections, you're not going to look very good. So if you're either going to object to someone else's premises, or if you want to sort of guard yourself against objections, make sure, first of all, that your conclusion is not false, because that's one thing that people will often try and do. They'll say, well, one reason why I disagree with this person is their conclusion is false. Or in other cases, perhaps their argument is flawed. The conclusion might not necessarily be false, but one or more of the premises might have a flaw in its logic, the premises might be unreliable, or the premises might not be strong enough for the conclusion. The premises might be true, but they might not carry enough weight, especially if the conclusion or the proposal that you're arguing for is something that a lot of people don't necessarily agree with. It's also a good idea to explore alternatives. This is especially true if you are proposing a solution to a problem. It's not enough just to say that you have a solution for a particular problem. You have to show why your solution is better than other possible solutions. So before you give your own proposal, try and think, are there any other proposals that people might support? And try and make sure that you're choosing the strongest one. Let's take a look at an example here really quickly. I'll start this off with a joke. What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks only 1 language? American. There's a European version of this joke, which is trilingual, bilingual, and British, I think. I'll use this joke as a segue to a proposal that it's a good thing if everybody, especially in English-speaking countries, learns a second language. And if we start from that assumption that learning a second language would be a good thing for everyone in an English-speaking country to do, you might come up with this sort of proposal. All college students in English-speaking countries should be required to study abroad in a non-English speaking country in order to learn a foreign language. That's what we want them to do, learn a foreign language. However, before you use that proposal, you might want to brainstorm a couple of alternative proposals. In this case, alternative number 1, all college students in English-speaking countries should be required to pass an intermediate foreign language course. Alternative 2, all college students in English-speaking countries should be required to download an app such as Duolingo to their phone. Now, let's take a look at these proposals and see which one is the strongest. Just to let you know, alternative number 1 is the strongest proposal. Let's take a look at why. This could be a question that I might put on the final exam, just putting that out there, where I might give you a few, I might give you a proposal and a couple of alternatives, and then I would ask you to decide which is the strongest proposal and to explain why it is stronger than the others, relatively so. In this case, alternative 1 is the best proposal for learning a foreign language. While it may not be 100% effective, it is possible to pass an intermediate language course without mastering the language. It has distinct advantages over the other proposals. Alternative 1 is better than the original because it's less burdensome. Not everyone is able to go abroad to study. It might not be feasible financially. Not everybody has the financial resources to go abroad. Other people might have family commitments that prevent them from going abroad. Alternative 1 is also better than alternative 2 because alternative 2 doesn't actually accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. In fact, it doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't mean you've learned anything about the language. And anyway, not everyone has a smartphone, so this alternative would be unfair to some people. Here are a few other policy proposals that I was thinking about doing in class, but we didn't have time for this exercise. The Korean government should invest in building more nuclear power plants to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. Now, for this one, you would need to obviously look at a few different alternatives. Okay, maybe it's good that Korea wants to reduce its dependence on foreign fossil fuels, for example, oil, coal. However, maybe nuclear power plants would not be the best way to accomplish that. You might want to think of 2 other alternatives. Or universities should pay 3rd and 4th year students to tutor 1st year students in difficult classes to help those freshmen make it through their 1st year. You might want to think of a couple of alternatives to that. And the last one, to reduce pollution and waste, Coffee shops should only serve for here drinks in coffee mugs rather than paper cups. Once again, you might say, well, reducing pollution is a very noble goal, but rather than just serving drinks in coffee mugs, here are two other solutions. Now, you don't need to do this for homework. This was just an example of an activity that I was planning to do in our last class. For homework, what I'd like you to do is just read chapter 8, which is argumentative essays. And we'll be starting our look at argumentative essays at the beginning of our next class, which will be Tuesday, May the 10th. So have a great weekend. I hope you enjoyed Children's Day, and I'll see you all next week. If you've got any questions about this lecture or anything else, please post your message on Sogong Talk Talk. All right, bye now.